Welcome to Lesson 8.5, Assess the Security Impact of Acquired Software. In your Candidate Information Bulletin, we are in Software Development Security. We are in Key Area of Knowledge C, which is Assess the Effectiveness of Software Security, and D, which is Assess Security Impact of Acquired Software. Our topics are going to include secure acquisition and the implementation process, governance, and cybersecurity. So security's day is just a technical issue is done. It's time to elevate software security from a standalone technical concern to an enterprise issue when both developing and acquiring software. So in our previous lessons, we talked about the software development process, and here we're going to talk about the acquisition process. And in both cases, it's absolutely vital that our organizations implement secure software. So we're going to approach this by walking through the secure software acquisition and implementation process. And we're going to start right at the very beginning here, which is business and resiliency requirements. So in collaboration with the business unit, the security professional wants to understand what are the objectives of the software so that we can strategically align the security requirements with how the software is going to be used, as well as the resiliency requirements, meaning what is the maximum tolerable downtime and how much data could afford to be lost. All of that's going to be important when you're doing the evaluation. So taking that information and working collaboratively with both technology folks and with the business unit, now we're going to define the selection criteria. That selection criteria might go out to vendors in the form of an RFP, or perhaps there's already vendors that there's personal relationships with, or ones that the business unit has already had their eye on. However that's going to happen, the selection criteria should go out to the vendor. The vendor then should provide information back about their product, including security documentation. And as a security professional, you're going to want to review carefully that security documentation. And specifically, you're going to want to understand the configuration options as they relate to security. You want to know what the defaults are, you want to know what the various options are, and you want to understand what the granularity is of those options. Once you have that information, you can conduct an initial risk assessment. Now, you haven't really implemented this, so we're just really looking at what the vendor has told us, what the vendor has provided us, what you've read in documentation. But you can start to do an initial risk assessment so that you can see if the operation and performance of the software is within organizational risk tolerance. If it is, well, we can go forward. If it's not, you've got to make this go-stop decision of do we continue looking or do we decide that this is not within the risk tolerance of the organization, so it's time to stop and perhaps start the process again by looking at other products. If you are going to go forward, next is conducting a vendor assessment. Now, the depth and the level of the vendor assessment will depend very much on how the software is being used and supported. If it's just an off-the-shelf piece of software that the vendor has no relationship to, it's just going to be installed locally, they're not going to be providing support, they're not doing any hosting, well, then there's one level of due diligence. But if it turns out that the vendor is actually going to be coming into your network to support it, well, there's certainly a whole other avenue of due diligence to be done. And then if it's going to be a cloud-based application, now we've got yet another type of due diligence that needs to be done. So you need to do a vendor assessment, obviously depending upon the type and the use and the performance and the vendor of the software. Once again, we're at a go-stop decision depending on the results of the vendor assessment. If all is good, then the next step would be to evaluate the software in your test environment using dummy data. You should always be using dummy data or non-real data or sanitized data. You never want to use actual client data or organizational data in your test environment because we haven't yet identified what the vulnerabilities are. You also want to make sure that your test environment is segmented from your corporate environment. Same reason. We don't know what the vulnerabilities are, and we don't want to introduce new issues into the corporate network. Once that evaluation is completed, we can once again update our risk assessment, make a decision here. Is this going to be the appropriate software? Does the business unit want to go forward? From a security perspective, are you comfortable with it? Is it within risk tolerance? Are the IT folks signing off on it? Ultimately, this becomes a business unit decision, but both technology and security operations should be influencing that business unit decision. Assume we go forward. Now we are into the install and test. The type of testing you're going to do really depends on the software. If it's internet-facing, you're going to want to be doing penetration testing. If it's internal and you've set up a brand new system for it, you're going to be wanting to doing vulnerability assessments. Matter of fact, you should probably do a vulnerability assessment in any case. And then other examinations may occur, again, just depending on the type of software. Once you've done your install and testing, now it's time to move it into production and monitor. And then we've always got to be aware that there may be new vulnerabilities that are discovered and new support patches that are released. So our last step is going to be ongoing vulnerability and patch management support. So thinking about security right at the very beginning here, when we're at our business requirements and resiliency stage, realizing that we're going to have security considerations all through the acquisition and implementation process, and then we have our ongoing vulnerability and patch management support. If we put all of this together, we should end up with having secure software implemented inside of our organization. Now, there's a really interesting collaborative effort that's going on out there. It's called Build Security In, and it's being sponsored by the Department of Homeland Security. And Build Security In is a collaborative effort that provides practices, tools, guidelines, rules, principles, and other resources that software developers, architects, and security practitioners can use to build security into software in every phase of its development. So this is the Build Security In website. There is a whole host of resources, best practices, knowledge base, tools, and other information out there. So I would encourage you to visit this site and learn more about the Build Security In collaborative effort. So that brings us to the end of Lesson 8.5. What we talked specifically about was the secure acquisition and implementation process. So let's do our Lesson 8.5, Match the Meaning. On the left-hand side are a number of terms that you've heard multiple times during these lessons, and a couple of new ones. Risk, risk assessment, a mitigating control, governance, dummy data, resiliency, cybersecurity, and CISSP. So put me on pause, take a few minutes, go ahead and match up the meanings, come on back, and we'll go through them together. All right, let's do our Lesson 8.5 terms. Risk is the potential for an unwanted event. A risk assessment is when we determine the threat likelihood and impact. Our mitigating controls is a control or action to reduce risk. Governance is leadership and decision making. Dummy data is either scrubbed, sanitized, or phony data. Resiliency is the ability to remain operational. Cybersecurity is protecting our communities from harm, and one of the best ways to protect our community from harm is to install secure software. And lastly, a CISSP is a well-respected security professional. So let's end this lesson with our CISSP exam tips. Number 1, security decisions should not be made in isolation. You're going to collaborate with technology, you're going to collaborate with the business units, you need to understand the threat environments, the vulnerabilities. It's really a very holistic process. The second is that risk assessment should be required at multiple phases in the procurement and acquisition process. We saw in our walkthrough 2 places where we did our risk assessments, plus 1 place where we did our vendor assessment. And lastly is that security should always be an enabler. So thanks for joining me for this lesson. I look forward to seeing you in the next.